Joining me now is former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. He served under President George W. Bush. Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon. So I wanted to start. You've been outspoken about how the Department of Justice is not biased against Republicans. What should people understand about the judicial process and the protections that are in it to kind of prevent that political bias, who maybe haven't worked at government at a high level or even a lower level?
Yeah, I think that people need to understand that just because the facts of one case look similar to another case doesn't mean that there is going to be a prosecution. People need to understand that the differences are based upon facts. Treatment of cases are based upon the facts and upon the judgment and experience of a prosecutor. You may have, in one case, a prosecutor who's very aggressive and is willing to take a chance on being aggressive in a prosecution. And another case with similar facts, you may have a prosecutor that's less experienced and perhaps a little bit more conservative. And so the fact that you may have a prosecution in one case and not a prosecution in another case doesn't mean at all that there's bias.
In this latest indictment in Georgia, Trump and 18 others are charged under the RICO Act. You've said you thought that the District Attorney Fani Willis did a good job laying out the case. You've also said that you think there's a good possibility that some of the other defendants could flip and become cooperating witnesses, which is often a part of the process. If you're not a lawyer, you don't always know that. But as you look at this, who specifically do you think would be the most likely to do so? And who do you think she would be most likely to go after?
Well, what I don't know is the kind of information that a particular witness, the prosecutor thinks has key information, key evidence that may be supportive of a point that is otherwise the prosecutor has concerns about getting into court, getting into evidence in the court. So it's hard for me to really gauge. Typically, it's going to be someone who is wrapped up in a major conspiracy like this, in a major case, but is charged in a lesser offense and really just kind of wants to get out of this. And so I think that's who you're going to be looking at, and that's who the prosecutor is going to be looking for. But again, it's going to be based upon the kind of information that prosecutor believes that witness may have that is vital, could be critical to the successful prosecution in this particular case.
There's also this argument that some Trump allies and also individuals who have been indicted are making that Fulton County is not the right venue for this case and should be brought in federal court. You've said you think Mark Meadows, who's the former White House chief of staff, has the strongest argument to have the case moved. There's also rumors that Donald Trump himself could make that case and make that request. Do you also think he would have a strong case to make, given he was a sitting president at the time?
Well, again, yes, their argument can be made. I don't believe that it'll be at the same strength that Mark Meadows' case will be, but I anticipate the president is going to do everything that he can to get this prosecution moved to federal court, because I just think that the treatment will be better. I think he also is concerned about, quite frankly, if there is a successful prosecution, he probably doesn't want to go to a state prison. He probably would rather be in a federal facility where his status as former president of the United States might give him additional benefits. And so, yeah, I think he really would like to get into the federal courts and leave Georgia behind.
One of the things that stuck out to me in reading these indictments, I'm not a lawyer, but I did serve in government for 2 presidents, were the ways in which Jeffrey Clark, who was a Department of Justice official, tried to use the Department of Justice and other officials to overturn the will of the people in the election. I mean, you've been a very vocal defender of the institution and the people who work there. What was your reaction when you read about his actions and his efforts?
Well, astonishment and anger. The fact that he would use that position, that power, in order to further this action, wishes of former President Trump. That is what hurts the institution, is when you have that kind of conduct that's not based upon the rule of law, that's not based upon expectations about how the department should conduct itself in terms of any kind of investigation or prosecution, and which is to be fair. You want to hold people accountable, but you want to be as fair as possible in making decisions with respect to individual conduct.
You've said on this network there should be cameras in the courtroom for the federal trial. There are a lot of people of both parties who agree with you. Many Democrats certainly, but certainly Republicans as well. It's a decision that would ultimately be up to the Chief Justice, John Roberts. I don't know how well you know him, but I assume you know him a little bit. What's your assessment of whether or not that's something he might consider or seriously consider or ultimately agree to in this case?
Well, I've said in the past that I might consider cameras in the courtroom for this case, but generally, as a former judge, I don't really favor cameras in the courtroom because I think it does affect behavior, and I think attorneys in this case,
yeah.
Well, and the reason why this case is different is because this is a case, again, against charges are conduct against democracy, against the American people. And so the stakes couldn't be higher. The other reason I think that perhaps in this case there should be cameras in the courtroom is because there is already a great deal of doubt in certain segments of the American population about our criminal justice system, about the rule of law. But if they see on camera that Donald Trump has received a fair trial and he is convicted based on the evidence by 12 impartial jurors, perhaps people, those supporters of Donald Trump and critics of the Department of Justice will be satisfied that, in fact, justice has been achieved. Now, of course, that puts a great deal of pressure upon the Department of Justice to get it right, but I have confidence that they can do that. But so those are the reasons why I think in this case, the Chief Justice might consider cameras in the courtroom, again, because of what's at stake. And because it might be reassuring to the American people, the outcome might be reassuring to the American people. Either way, whether acquitted or convicted, I think if they have confidence that they've observed the trial, that the constitutional protections have been provided to this defendant, I think that they'll be satisfied.
One of the big questions out there, and you have been a big defender of equal treatment, equal justice under law, everybody being treated the same, is if Donald Trump is convicted and sentenced to serve time, should he go to prison despite being a former president? I know we're getting ahead of where we are at this moment, but what is your view on that in general?
You're right. We're getting way ahead of ourselves. I haven't really thought about it. I think he should, if in fact he's convicted of the crimes charged by Jack Smith in the Department of Justice, yeah, I think he should serve time, quite frankly. Look, there are people that on January 6th went to the Capitol, maybe not at the clear direction of President Trump, but certainly he did nothing to stop what happened that day. They're serving time. And so if, in fact, the crimes, if, in fact, Jack Smith is successful in prosecuting Donald Trump for the crimes that he's charged, I think it would be fair that he go to prison. But we're a long way from there.
Former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Jen.